We are standing on one of the mountains surrounding Shchem, surrounding Nablus. Nablus is located in the valley and is surrounded by 4 mountains. One of them is this mountain on which we are standing now. The name of this mountain is Har Kabir, in Arabic Jabal Kabir. The other one to the south, east-south, is the mountain of Akrabe. Now there is a Jewish settlement located on that mountain, Itamar, and to the west we can see 2 mountains. One is the mountain of Gerizim to the left, to the south, and one is Eival, the mountain of Eval, to the right, to the north. So there are 4 mountains surrounding Nablus. We know from the Bible that the first site in which Abraham got the first promise of the land was here in the area of Nablus, of Shchem, on one of the mountains. We read in the Bible, Genesis chapter 12, verse 6, and Avram passed through the land to the place of Shchem, Nablus, unto the tree of Moreh. It was an oak tree. And the Canaanites were at that time in the land, and the Lord appeared to Abraham, to Abraham, and said, "To thy seed will I give this land." So God showed him the land and told him, promised him to give the land to his descendants, to the people of Israel. And the question is, of course, on which mountain did Abraham stand when he got the first promise? We have 4 possibilities, because 4 mountains are surrounding Nablus. It is very clear that he stood on a mountain, because God told him, "To thy seed shall I give this land." So he showed him the land. It must be that he stood on a mountain and saw the land. And the question is, on which mountain? There is another question in the book of Deuteronomy. In the last days of Moses, of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Moses, Moses gave Joshua several orders, and one of the orders was to build an altar on the mountain of Eval, which we see to the right, on the mountain of Eval. We read in the Bible, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 27, verse 4. "And it shall be, when you have gone over the Yarden, over the Jordan River, that you shall set up these stones, which I command you this day, in Mount Eval, and thou shalt cover them with plaster. And thou shalt offer peace offerings, and shall eat there, and rejoice before the Lord thy God. And thou shalt write upon the stones all the words of this Torah very plainly." So Joshua was ordered to build an altar and to write the words of God, the words of the Torah, on the stones of the altar. And the question is, of course, why on the mountain of Eval? Why not on the mountain of Gerizim or in some other mountain? The second question about Joshua is much stronger, because we know that according to the Torah, the 6 tribes who are supposed to get the blessing should stand on the mountain of Gerizim to the left, and those who are supposed to get the curse should stand on the mountain of Eval to the right. So it was much more proper to build the altar on the mountain of Gerizim, which is the mountain of the blessing, and not on the mountain of Eval. So why did Moses order Joshua to build the altar on the mountain of Eval? As we have said many times, Muslim tradition usually preserves ancient Jewish traditions. And here also we can see a Muslim maqam. This is the grave of Sheikh Bilal, who was one of the assistants of Khalif Omar, who conquered the land of Israel in the 7th century. Probably Sheikh Bilal was buried here because of the Jewish tradition which identified the site of Abraham on top of Jabal Kabir. I think that the second question can help us to answer the first question. If we look at the 4 mountains surrounding Nablus, surrounding Shchem, all of them are less than 900 meters above sea level. The mountain of Eval is the highest mountain in this group of mountains, while Har Eval, the mountain of Eval, is the highest mountain. Its height is 945 meters above sea level. So only from Har Eval we can see the whole land of Israel to all directions. So probably Abraham stood on the highest mountain because God told him, "To thy seed shall I give this land." He showed him the land. And only from the mountain of Eval you can see the whole land. And that is exactly the reason why Joshua was ordered to build the altar on the mountain of Eval. Because Joshua and the people of Israel came back to the land of Israel after the long exile in Egypt. And of course, the question that they had to answer was, what is the right of the Jewish people to invade the land and to conquer it and to expel the inhabitants of the land of Canaan? And the answer is given in the Bible very clearly. The justification to this conquest is the promise of God to Abraham. That's why Joshua, the first thing he did after they crossed the Jordan River was to come to this mountain to build an altar on the same place that Abraham built his altar, in order to bring the message, to convey the message. We are here on the basis of the promise that God gave to Abraham right on this mountain, right in this place. He built an altar and got a promise, and we are building an altar in order to fulfill the promise. This is the moral right of the Jewish people to come to Israel and to conquer the land. And this is exactly the right of the Jewish people in our time, to come back to the land of Israel after 2,000 years of exile. Not 200 years as in Egypt, but after 2,000 years of exile. And we are back in this land on the basis of the promise to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, given almost 4,000 years ago. And it is very interesting that after the 6-day war, these mountains were liberated by Israel, and Jewish settlements were built and established on these mountains. We can see the settlement of Elon Moreh. We can see the settlement of Har on the mountain of Gerizim. And the first settlers who came back to these mountains after the 6-day war, they found on the mountain of Eval a big pile of stones. And they invited an archaeologist named Professor Adam Zartal in order to find out what these stones are. And he excavated that site and found an altar from the time of Joshua. We're standing on top of Mount Eval, and we can see just below us, we can see the altar of Joshua. The altar is surrounded by a low wall. The low wall signifies the area in which it is allowed to eat the meat of the sacrifices. Just as we can see in Jerusalem, in Bethel, in Shiloh, in Givon, and in other places. We can see that the altar is not located on top of the mountain, it is located on the slope of the mountain, because according to the Bible, the prayer should be in a low place, not on top of the mountain, but on the slope of the mountain, to express your humility, to express your modesty when you stand in front of God. We can see the altar from the time of Joshua. Professor Adam Zartal discovered this altar about 30 years ago, and he found here 2 altars. The big altar, which we can see from the time of Joshua, it contains the main building of the altar and 2 staircases going up from the west. One of the indications that this is the altar of Joshua is the fact that Adam Zartal found here many bones of animals that were sacrificed on this altar. But all the bones of the animals that he found here are kosher animals, pure animals. And this is one of the proofs, one of the indications that this is an Israelite altar, probably from the time of Joshua. Inside the big altar, he found a small altar, older than the big altar. According to my suggestion, the big altar is from the time of Joshua, and the small altar inside the big altar is from the time of Abraham. And the generation of Joshua built the bigger altar right on top of the older altar in order to convey the message to the people of Israel and to all the world. The promise of God, the covenant of God with the people of Israel, which gave the people of Israel the right to come back to the land, is the moral justification of our existence here. It was the justification in the time of Joshua, and it is the moral justification of the state of Israel in our time